So we're talking about strategy, OKRs. How do we get everyone to think more strategically in the business? I think it's really good to ground people in like the basics, right? The purpose of business is two things, according to Peter Drucker. I think we forget this sometimes. It's to create and keep customers. Like, that's it. He's considered the founder of modern management. So when we think about strategy, like, where did that actually come from? I wanted to know. And it comes from the Greek word strategos, which means army leader, right? And it's meant to mean military general, which I think is really interesting. If we think about then what is strategy, there are really three components. There is a diagnosis, there's a guiding policy, and there are coherent actions. And so now we can start to see, oh, that makes sense why the roots of strategy is wedded to that Greek word. So a good strategy starts with this diagnosis of the situation. You're defining a particular challenge that the organization faces. Think about like a doctor that is diagnosing a patient before prescribing treatment. A guiding policy is a broad set of methods to address that diagnosed problem. You're not trying to get into specific details, but rather the general direction in which the action should take you. And then the coherent actions are those tangible steps, those resources, the actions that the organization is going to commit to in alignment with that guiding policy. If you're interested in thinking about this more, I suggest reading Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, The Difference and Why It Matters by Richard Rummelt. But ultimately, strategy is a choice, right? And actually, if you think about it more deeply, it's a set of 5 choices. A.G. Lafley, which is the CEO, and Roger Martin outlined this in their book, Playing to Win. There are 5 questions you're asking yourself. The first is, what is our winning aspiration? Like, what is the purpose of us being here? Where do we play, right? That means where are we competing? What are our geographies? What are the product categories? What are our customer segments? What are the channels? What are the stages of our production? Then you need to think about how to win. Like, how are you going to win, right? That's the value prop. That's your competitive advantage. And then you need capabilities, right, to win. Like, those are the reinforcing activities, your specific configuration of your organization. And then lastly, and I think this is where OKRs fit, ultimately, is the enabling management system. So those are the structures, the measures required to support the choices that we've made. And again, if you want to read the book, we won't go too much into it, but I'm a really big fan, and a lot of people who read about strategy have read this book, Playing to Win, How Strategy Really Works. Now, here's the thing. Like, I don't think anybody would disagree with this. Strategy misses can be very expensive. Right? How many people remember the Amazon Fire phone, for example? Here's an example of what that looked like back in the day. I almost forgot that this existed. And I was wondering to myself, well, what happened? Like, what happened to them? How did this become this ultimate strategic failure? In 2010, Amazon was really worried. They thought, oh my gosh, like Apple and Google is biting into our market share because any purchase that was made through the Amazon mobile app would fall under license agreements of the software providers' app stores, right? And the sales were being siphoned off of Amazon's already very thin profit margins. For iOS, that could be as high as 30%, right? So Jeff Bezos was like, we got to do something about this. He envisioned this new idea where they had contactless payments, hand-free interactions that allowed users to navigate through mid-air gestures, kind of what you saw with Apple and what they've done with the whole glasses thing. They wanted a force-sensitive grip that could respond to different ways and different levels of physical pressure. And then in 2014, they launched this thing. Mind you, Project Tito did not include all of that stuff. For a limited time, Amazon offered a promotion where they gave, I think, 1,000 Amazon coins and a free year of Amazon Prime to get people to actually buy this thing. And they priced it at the same price point as the Android and Apple flagship smartphones of that time. A year later, they discontinued the phone. They stopped production. And if you look at their reports, the SEC Form 10Q filing, they recorded charges estimated at $170 million. So that's how much they wrote off. And that had to do with the phone inventory that they couldn't sell and the supplier commitment costs that they had incurred. They also realized that there were like these inventories with resellers, non-cancelable supplier commitments. It was a mess. And so they shut everything down. They ceased production in August. They shut it all down and wrote it off in September of 2014 of that year. So we see it was just a really ugly time for Amazon. Where did they go wrong? Let's go back to the strategy components we learned from Richard Rummels, right? The diagnosis. Their diagnosis was based on lost sales. They failed to uphold their first leadership principle. Like if you go to their website and you look at leadership principles for Amazon, number one for them is customer obsession. Leaders are supposed to start with the customer and work backwards. They're supposed to earn and keep their customers' trust. And even though you should be paying attention to your competitors, you don't want to obsess over them, right? You want to obsess over your customers. The guiding policy of that time was very much micromanagement, which I was kind of surprised to find out. When anyone was asked on the teams that were working on the Amazon Fire Phone, why are we doing this? The answer was, because Jeff wants it. And then you're supposed to have a set of coherent actions, right, that support the diagnosis and the guiding policy so that you can actually execute against it. So they created their own ecosystem. They modified Android's version. They restricted the Amazon App Store, even though at that time, Google and Apple had pretty robust like environments and ecosystems. They also exclusively allowed only AT&T to distribute these phones, and they did not budge on price. So here they are thinking, look at all the amazing features and functionality that you're going to get by buying the Amazon phone. Plus, we're going to give you a free year of Amazon Prime. We're going to give you 1,000 coins or whatever. They forgot that it's not about what you do. You have to root it in some sort of diagnosis of what it is that you're trying to achieve. What is the value you're supposed to deliver to that customer? You're supposed to acquire customers and keep them. Remember, that's why businesses exist. And they thought about it differently. They thought about their profits. They thought about their competition. They thought about what they could do with this new tech, but they forgot the core, which is the customer. So at the end of the day, strategy is supposed to provide the guiding principles for making organizational decisions. I would argue there are two sides of the house when we think about our business. The stuff that's the KTLOs, the keep the lights on, or some people call it business as usual. You measure those with KPIs. Like these are the things that you need to continue doing so that you can continue to exist. All of this is rooted in your mission, vision, and values, like the definition of your destination. But if you need to, and we argue that you need to do this, you need to be changing the business also, whilst also running that business. And the way to be changing or thinking about changing the business is through those OKRs. And then there's a bunch of work. And that work, whether it's tasks, projects, epics, whatever programs, they're in support of one of those two ideas. Either you're running the business or you're changing the business. And you're doing a bunch of work, hopefully, to do one of those. And if you're not, then I'm not sure what's going on. You probably should reevaluate where your time is spent. And that's why it's important to talk about strategic thinking. Strategic thinking is supposed to fuel our plans, and ultimately those plans will be executed. And there are really 5 elements to strategic thinking, right? I believe that strategic thinking can be taught and learned, and there are a bunch of really smart people, much smarter people than me, who for a long time said so as well. And the 5 elements is having a systems perspective, being intent-focused, thinking in time, being hypothesis-driven, and having intelligent opportunism. So what does that actually mean, right? Systems perspective is understanding that you need to look at the holistic view of how things work, right? How do the different parts of the organization influence each other? Because they do. And the second part, this intent focus, is really about conveying this directional sense, right? You're trying to continuously shape and adjust your intent. And as you're thinking about what you're spending your time on and your energy around that intent focus, is you're not only thinking about the future, but you're thinking about where you are today and the intent of that future, which is why we spend so much time talking about being hypothesis driven. Like, what if we did this? Or what if we achieved that? so that we can get from where we are today to where we're going to go in the future. And that means when we're making these decisions, we're taking advantage of this intelligent opportunism, those alternate strategies that may emerge in a rapidly changing environment, which we find ourselves in. It's very complex systems that we're working in very complicated environments, right? If we were to look at maybe those elements in light of like concepts or techniques, there are so many ways for us to get the system's perspective, the intent focus, thinking in time, hypothesis driven, intelligent opportunism. And you see some of those relevant strategy concepts and techniques here. If you're curious about any of them, feel free to ask, but we're not going to delve too deep into those. What we'll do though is connect some concepts that we've talked through so far and revisit some of the ones that you may have seen elsewhere that actually fit in the storyline. So remember, strategy is that diagnosis. It's the guiding policy. It's that set of coherent actions. Well, you're going to ask, well, Jenny, what's the problem with being disconnected? Like, I have a bunch of work to do. I know what I need to go do. I'm totally fine. What happens is when you're not connected with the overall strategy, then every person or team has their own strategy. They're going in their own separate direction. If there's a gap between strategy and what's being executed, you're not going to be able to improve where you are today, right? And if you're focused solely on getting execution right and not really considering strategy in your work, that's not great either, because you're thinking about short-term fixes. Like the short-term fixes build up into long-term things, but only if you have a strategy to connect to. So one of the things I think is interesting to think through is creating for yourself a framework to connect the work in agile environments to that strategy. I believe that OKRs fit in between bets and actions. Let's break down what is called the strategy kernel canvas. It was introduced by Chris Butler, and the link is here. The beginning is the history. How do we get to where we are now? The diagnosis, you saw that as part of the 3 elements of strategy that Richard Rommel talks about. It's the explanation of the nature of the challenge that we're facing. Then you need that guiding policy. Like, what's your secret? How are you going to create or exploit an advantage that you might have? You're going to place a series of bets, and then there's something that I like how he calls it bet against. We'll go through this in detail in a second. And then there's going to be a set of actions or processes. These are the things that are going to help you achieve your policies. And ultimately, should all of this work out or get measured, we'll be able to see our success and be able to understand the criteria for survival, because that's what we want to do, is to continue to exist as businesses that acquire customers and keep them, right? So let's talk about Uber, which a lot of people are probably very familiar with, right? The history is they started in 2009. They were in 58 different countries. They had like a $41 billion valuation. Diagnosis was, there's a typo. Passengers are frustrated with the lack of clarity, efficiency, options, and accountability in how they were transporting themselves here and there, right? Their guiding policy was, what if we could create a marketplace where drivers and passengers could find each other in real time and we can reduce everyone's overall costs? The bets that they made, the drivers don't need to be employees. If you're a taxi company, they do. Right? There are no pre-scheduled trips, at least back then. Now you can pre-schedule them. I've done it a few times. They've changed that bet. There were network effects that they believed mattered. They betted against this thing, the thing that everyone else cared about, but they didn't care about. They ignored local taxi regulations. They were like, you know what? We know that there are regulations. We don't care. We'll do our stuff anyway. And then they had a bunch of actions that they wanted to take, right? They had apps for the platforms. They did some buzz marketing. They had bounties for new drivers. They wanted to do cashless payments. They kind of hid the tips and the fees from the customer to some extent. They managed that marketplace in a way that they could take advantage of potential surge pricing for peak hours, for example. And so they had ideas for how they're going to measure success, right? What if we had a 1-to-1 ratio of riders available to drivers? What if we got repeat ridership by passengers? What if we put the local taxi services out of business, or at least we challenged them? Like, there were things that they needed to think about, and you can think about the strategy kernel canvas in a time horizon, which we've talked about in terms of strategic thinking. Where were we before? Where are we now? and where do we want to be in the future? And these are things that we're going to be mindful of. I believe OKRs fit here, right? You're making these overarching bets, right? Drivers don't need to be employees, network effects matter, we're going to ignore local taxi regulations. And then there's a bunch of actions, but what are your goals? Like, how are you going to define them? And then ultimately the things that keep your business model, looking the way it does, to make sure that they're not, they're within the acceptable thresholds. These are the KPIs. These are the things that keep you going, right? Those are the criteria that you mean for success, right? They belong together. And the way to think about OKRs, I think ultimately from a strategic perspective, is they are about changing the business. If we look at how, let's say, John Cutler has defined this, and I'm sure a lot of you follow him online, he's like, so you have your strategy, you have a current business model of how you make money, you're going to protect that to the extent that you're able to survive, right? All of that will be measured in some way. Ideally through our KPIs, we will be able, maybe downstream, to identify different leverage points that we could exploit and do something about. We will design experiments so that we can intervene in these areas, and then we can measure that impact, integrate those learnings, and potentially feed those learnings back into our strategy, back into the model, back into our measurements. Because what if something that we tried in our design experiments, our bets, actually materialized into something that now should be a standard part of how we do business? Then you're going to naturally feed that back into the model. You're going to keep your eye on it in KPIs and maybe try to reattack it, because maybe there are other areas of exploitation that you might want to review. I feel like this is a really good way to think about using that data, thinking about the outcomes that you want to achieve, and integrating that into how we think about building product and connecting what product or people who deliver on a daily basis, and that's why we're talking about this as part of the Agile community, to the market, to the business, to the parts that are really customer facing, right? So again, KPIs live here, they're persistent. OKRs live here. They're point in time measures. So for those who may not be familiar with OKRs or briefly skim over that, this is a standard formula. We will accomplish some objective, right, as measured by these key results. A good objective is clearly defined. It states what we want to achieve, why it's important, why we're doing it now, and what we imagine that future state to be. This is why this is strategic thinking, right? And a good key result, the measurements, right, shows how we know we've achieved that objective. And these are typically quantitative in nature, right? We want them to be measurable. We want them to be as outcomes focused as possible. And outcomes ideally in service of our customer, and maybe even changing their behavior to do something that will benefit them and ultimately would service us, because they're going to continue being our customer once we've acquired them. I really like how Alex talks about this. If you've not read or looked at his presentation, Coordination Headwind, How Organizations Are Like Slime Molds, totally look at this. At the end of the day, right, if we're all looking at the moon, and let's imagine that the moon is like the strategy, like we understand our destination, like this is kind of where we want to end up. If we just sided off of that and try to get there, it would be impossible. We would get really frustrated. If we just executed and we did not know strategy, if we did not understand it and were able to connect with it, we would be doing this random walk through the opportunity space kind of aimlessly. And so what we're trying to do by using OKRs and also being informed by the strategy, those 3 things that we've defined and the 5 questions we should ask ourselves, we're taking these iterative shots, siding off that moon so that we can get the best of both worlds, right? We're making the jump and we're not randomly walking, but we are walking toward a destination in our opportunity space. Now imagine what that would look like then if all of the teams were siding off of that same moon, which is why it's important for everyone to have contextualized that strategy and have OKRs hopefully to establish what the priorities are, like what is important to the business and how are we going to know through the measures. Over time, our teams will naturally converge, right? This is that concept that you'll hear senior leaders talk about with this idea of loosely coupled yet tightly aligned parts of our organization, because we have now an agreed upon strategy. there are likely going to be smaller risks of disagreements. If we disagree, it's probably on the tactical level. And that's important to distinguish, right? So then how do we take those iterative roof shots? I really learned this from Alex Monville. He was on my podcast, Dreams with Deadlines. He shared with me this wonderful idea called impact maps, which I didn't know until I met him. And his example was thinking through the why, the who are your actors, the how, and the what. So in this example he shared with me on my show, he said, you know, our why could be we want to have a really lovely picnic, me and my partner, let's say. And the who are the actors. Who's involved in having this picnic? It could be me and my partner and a mosquito or a lot of mosquitoes. Now, my goal is not to have a beautiful picnic, but how do I make sure that I have a beautiful picnic? Well, I need to make sure that those mosquitoes don't show up and they don't bite any of us. And then there are the tactics. Those are the actions. Those are the to-dos. You can, whatever you want to call them, the things that we're going to do about it. We could fix any water, stagnation. We can plant repulsive plants or bring them with us. We can have sound devices. We can use off lotions. We can have certain candles. Like there's all kinds of ways that we can repel the mosquito, right? In order to have this beautiful picnic where we have everything prepared. If we define our why and our what and our how, we end up with a really wonderful framing, right? We have our objective, like what is it we're trying to achieve? We have our key result in the form of we want 0 mosquitoes to bite us, let's say in this example. And then the what could be all of the things that we'll do thereafter, but we know what we want to achieve. We have this common definition of success, and we're able to measure that in a really wonderful way. If we put this in a product context, a lot of you have probably seen this with Teresa Torres. She talks about opportunity tree, solution trees all the time, right? Thinking about your key result, how you're going to measure success tied to your overall objective. Again, we're laddering this idea of strategic thinking across our organization. We start with what is that we want to achieve and how we believe we're going to best measure that. And from there, we glean our opportunities and we think through the opportunity space. We think how we're going to solve those, and we'll test so that we can increase our confidence that what we're going to dedicate our time to is worth it. We think that there's a high probability that what we'll actually release or produce will get us that intended outcome. We want to be able to break this down so that we don't waste our time doing things that don't matter, right? At the end of the day, then, you're defining your why, your how, your what at every level of the business. And if you're working with OKRs, typically, you will have a cadence of an annual one for, let's say, the company level, or maybe it's a department level. You'll have a tighter rhythm of thinking about strategy and checking in to say, are we unified in action? Are we focused on the right outcomes? Are the priorities what they need to be so that we can learn and adapt in service of our customer, right? Acquiring them and keeping them because we're delivering consistent value. And then from there, the teams could be thinking about this on more tactical cadence. And we break this down even further. If you're in the Scrum environment, for example, you think about sprints and you'll be thinking about 2-week increments or whatever. All of this is broken down and builds up in a way so that we understand that our levels of engagement ultimately are blurring. They don't need to correspond to hierarchical levels because all of us at every level of the business, I believe, should be concerned with implementing the strategy, which means that we need to be reevaluating it constantly on the basis of some information, which we know is incomplete, but is the best to our knowledge, because business is dynamic. We understand that. But that means that that information needs to be shared, and we need to be thinking about that up front. Now, why does that then matter to the individual or the team? I would suggest this because all of us at the end of the day want to know that our work matters, that we're actually producing the outcomes that we want. And a way to think about that, I think, is framing it from the perspective of a recruiter. For example, if you're looking for a new job or you're thinking about your resume, oftentimes they're not going to ask you about the things that you did. They're going to ask you about the results. So if we are able on a regular basis to think about our situation, to highlight the tasks that we're doing, that we know what actions we're taking, and we're able to discuss the results because we thought about those up front, I think we're going to be in a much better position to corporately or collectively make advances from where we are today to where we as an organization to be in the future. But that you as an individual, or you as a team leader, or you as a manager are able to also demonstrate the value of the work that you're investing a lot of time in, because you've thought about it upfront and you've thought about how this impacts the customer in the acquisition of those customers and also the retention of those customers and helping them be happy with whatever solution you've provided in market. I know this is a lot of information, but it really is, I think, a culmination of a lot of people thinking through how to create organizations that are really disruptive and innovative. And I really believe if you're able to keep in your mind that at any given point in time, I'm working on either maintaining the current business model, improving and iterating and optimizing for it, or I'm doing something net new that changes the business and the lives of the customers, you're going to be in a much better place if you can hold those concepts in your head. And with that, I think we have wrapped it up. And I don't know if we have any questions. If you want me to review any of this stuff, happy to do so. But that is very much the end of my presentation. Oh, and I'm horrible at this. Thank you very much. I'm Jenny Herald if you want to find me on LinkedIn, and you can check out my podcast, which is on all kinds of platforms, called Dreams with Deadlines. We talk about strategy execution a lot, the challenges of agile practices, and really getting organizations to perform. Thank you for your time today.